Oh, now what?
Running out 9 times the speed of sound. Rocket.
We made it to episode 5, guys. In the previous 4 episodes, I pulled the OM642 motor out of my GL X164 Mercedes in the hope of doing some basic maintenance and tracking down an oil leak that was making everything just miserably dirty. In the meantime, I went ahead and did a bunch of servicing, such as replacing the steering rack, fixing sort of the transfer case, upgrading and cleaning up a ton of stuff on the motor, sort of rebuilding and cleaning up the manifolds, getting the turbo rebuilt, and so on and so forth. In episode 5, we have to get that motor in the car. So first things first, we're gonna get all of the rest of the parts back on the motor, including the manifolds, the turbo, and everything else is just scattered all over my garage floor, including these mystery boxes here. Lots of work to do, and hopefully by the end of this episode, we'll get this motor started. Let's go. Before we actually throw these back on the motor, I want to talk about a couple of things that I've mentioned in previous episodes. There's 2 items that I wanted to do with the manifolds out because it's fairly impossible to actually do them with everything back in the car. The first thing I wanted to do was to delete the EGR cooler because like I said in the previous episode, my EGR system is actually disabled in the software. The EGR valve, which sits right here and generally lets exhaust air through there, through the cooler and into your intake manifold, is actually always shut off. That means that this pipe, which normally feeds the intake with soot and garbage, is pointless. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. But deleting the EGR cooler was a little bit more complicated than that. The EGR cooler itself, as you can imagine, has 2 sort of components to it. It's got the exhaust gas side, which is the big pipe, cooler, and coming out here. And it actually has the coolant side, which comes out through here and out this way. I could have easily deleted this whole system, but I have one issue with this pipe inlet here. There's an O-ring sitting inside here, and the whole pipe is being held together by the actual cooler, which means that if I was to chop this off, there's nothing stopping this pipe from coming right out. Now, if you're a good fabricator, if you have the right tools, this is fairly straightforward. Either weld a bit of a tab or weld the actual pipe in place or whatever. But I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to go and start fabbing up stuff that possibly could fail and actually force me to take this apart again, all that. And the reality is I didn't have any leaks off the EGR cooler, and this doesn't really cause any negative effects on the car. It's not really being used. All it is right now is just a coolant bypass. That's all it is. The rest of the side is actually not used. So I've decided to leave the cooler in the interest of saving time and reducing the fabrication work. There is a kit for sale, which was actually not available. Like, you can find it on our website, but it wasn't available to purchase. And it's about $450 for an EGR delete, which comes with a couple of flanges, that kind of stuff. It actually has a pipe that goes from here straight into here with a couple of tabs. That's the proper way to do it. If you really care and you really want to remove this, that's the way to go about it. I wasn't going to bother trying to fab up a pipe or pay $450 just to get rid of this. That's not going to happen. I'm still going to fab up a couple of flanges to close these ports off because I do not plan on hooking up the exhaust back to the intake manifold. So I've got 2 flanges. I've got one on the manifold, one on the actual Y piece that connects the turbo. I need to cap these off, and I'm still going to use the EGR valve to fill all the holes in place. The second thing that I want to talk about was the actual swivel flap motor. These fail on a lot of these vehicles. Once they fail, they cause all sorts of issues. Common points of failure: the motor burns out because oil leaks all over it, so it can short out, burn out. The flaps themselves can actually get stuck because of all the soot that's being built up. Once the flaps get stuck, you can have a broken linkage here, etc., 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 etc. It's in the interest of maintainability to delete this system, but my swivel flap system, the motor, the flaps, everything was actually still operational. Yeah, they were pretty clogged up, which I've attempted to clean up as much as possible, but all of the flaps were moving freely. I didn't have any broken linkages. So the decision was sort of the same as the EGR cooler, which was it's a lot easier to just put the system back together. It's working, it's cleaned up, there's no exhaust gas going to gum it up anymore. Put it back together and just hope for the best. Now, if in the future this starts giving me problems. It's not too hard to delete the system, but for now, we're gonna leave it in place. It still works. Why cause more problems? With that out of the way, let's get these manifolds on the motor. Let's get the harness wired through, and let's put back the injectors, turbo, and everything else that we're still missing before we can put the engine back in the car. Okay, I'm gonna be honest, I've never done this before. I tried it a couple of different ways with the two manifolds separated, but I couldn't get it to work because of the center aluminum piece here that connects the two of them. It just prevents you from sliding them into place. So I used the motor and the motor mounting bracket to join up the two manifolds together so they become one big piece that just kind of drops on top of the heads. So now we're gonna put the bolts in, and I think what I'm gonna do is I'm going to actually loosen up the motor, tighten the manifolds, and then tighten the motor in place. So the manifolds are properly seated to the heads, and the motor just adjusts itself in place rather than the other way around. One thing I like to do when I kind of do these jobs is to do a little bit of gasket port matching. You can get an idea of how bad this is. You can kind of see the lip there. This is the turbo collector, so this comes off the two manifolds, goes into the turbo. So you can kind of see it there. This is where the gasket seals, that's the outer ring, and everything on the inside is actually just a sort of wall for the exhaust gas to go through. So I think what I'm going to do is port match the two sides to sort of get rid of this lip and make it open it a little bit better so the exhaust can flow. And on the turbo side, it's kind of the same thing. You've got this sort of, you can open up this lip a little bit so that the gasket matches. I haven't seen the turbo. The turbo is rebuilt. I'm not sure I want to start grinding on that right now, but maybe it's not going to be so bad, so we'll take a look at that after. With that out of the way, let's get the turbo pedestal in, turbo, collector, and then fab up some of the flanges at the back. Ah, crap. Get in there. Get in there. You know when you're building an engine and you're rushing to get it done, the truck needs to be back on the road, and you're installing the turbocharger, all new parts, you're so excited about it, right? And you think in your head, hey, listen, I think that wiring harness has to go in before the turbo. And you're like, nah, brain, you're silly. That's clearly not the case. And then you just install everything up, and then turns out that you're completely right and the harness has to go in before. Well, that's just what happened, and now I have to take everything back apart so that I can put the harness in before the turbo. There we go. Harness is in. Unfortunately, it goes under the turbo, so if you kind of screw things up, it takes a little bit of time to put it back together. Actually, I was lucky enough, I have a spare harness because all of this plastic stuff was very, very brittle on my old harness, and it was falling apart, so I actually ended up replacing it. So this was a good thing. Next thing we're going to do is the EGR. The next big thing to tackle are the fuel injectors. I have to admit I made a mistake when I took these out of the engine. I didn't have the manual at the time. Now that I've read the actual instructions from Mercedes, they specifically say that these kind of have to go back in the same position that they were in. And if they don't, you have to do an injector calibration. And they're asking for 7-digit alphanumeric code. So it's either the one on the top here or the one on the side here. They're both 7 digits. I'm not really sure. I've never really done this before on the 647s that we've built. We've never written down which injector is which. So what I'm going to do is put these back in sort of a random order because I did not write them down. And hope for the best. And I'll see if the car's kind of running rough or whatever. If I get codes for this stuff, then I may have to go to the dealership and get them sort of calibrated again. I did write down all of the codes here for the positions, so hopefully that will work well. As per the manual, you have to put some anti-seize on the injector and obviously new copper rings. And I also have new return line O-rings. So here we go. These are torqued to 62 inch-pounds plus 180 degrees. Injector lines. They're all the same, so you can't really get these wrong. Just hand tighten for now, because we're gonna have to install the other side. Everything's still pretty loose here. For the last one here, actually you have to unclip the harness. I made a mistake because I already had it put in position, but you can't really access the line very well if the harness is fixed in place, so you have to kind of unclip it to get to it. So of course I decided to put the return line after everything else, but it goes under the main fuel rail. So now I have to undo everything we just did so I can snake this in and put it back together. Brilliant. I'm going to get the two gaskets replaced for the oil filter housing, one between the housing and the motor, and one's right in the middle of the housing. To be honest, these are about the worst I've seen on the motor so far. They're completely burnt. So it's entirely possible that these two were leaking pretty hard, which would explain all of the oil buildup on the actual housing. So this you can access from the front of the motor. If you have a leak in this area, this would be a good place to start because, like I said, these have been the worst out of all of the ones I've taken so far. Pretty happy I got the two gaskets replaced. They were pretty burned out, as I was saying. I had to replace the O-ring on this little temperature sensor. This is behind here. If you remember, this whole area was completely covered in oil. So this was clearly leaking. Aside from the possibility of any of the other 12 gaskets that are sitting here, they were actually leaking as well. But this needs a new O-ring for sure. The engine is pretty much ready to go in the truck. The last thing I want to do is actually cap the AGR port here because the AGR has been disabled anyways. And actually I want to cap the AGR inlet at the bottom of the intake elbow or pipe, whatever you want to call it here, which is coming out of that AGR port there. So this is the AGR cooler on the front. The elbow comes around here and feeds the EGR into the pipe. Now, I showed you in a previous episode what that looks like. It's pretty caked up. and I have actually no way of cleaning that up, nor do I have any desire of doing that. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to make a flange like this so I can close that port off, and I'm going to make a flange like this, okay, to cap that off. Okay, let's do it. Last but not least is the exhaust system. Now, I mentioned in the beginning, probably somewhere in episode 1, that I wanted to delete the DPF and the urea system because they're disabled anyways. That said, my original plan was to gut the DPF and leave the rest of the exhaust in place. I kind of looked at it, we took it apart. I think it would be way too much work to just start bashing at this and trying to clean it up. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to put this back together the way it is. Whether that's a good idea or not, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I haven't done this before. Now, when the DPF got software disabled, it was my understanding that the whole thing will just, stop working within, a couple of cycles there. But the car has been working like this for a good 1.5 years, 2 years now. So now whether I haven't done enough mileage or maybe it just works fine, I don't really know. The point is that it still works fine, possibly down on power, I couldn't tell you, but the system works. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put it back together because I wanna get it back on the road. And ultimately my goal is to get a new exhaust system down for this. But it's minus 30 outside, supply's a bit low, I'm having a hard time finding parts, and the car needs to get back on the road. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna leave the exhaust for the spring. And actually, because the straight pipe that's available as an aftermarket unit is about $1,200, I think what I'm gonna try and do is I'm gonna use this as a sort of test case to find a good exhaust tech somewhere around me. I had a phenomenal exhaust guy, and he retired. And I would say a phenomenal. The guy would punch out a whole turbo back exhaust, bends, welds, placement, everything within a morning. So he would go in a couple hours, $400 or $500, and you give a turbo back exhaust there. So he was really, really good at that. Unfortunately, he retired. He was having some back issues. So now pretty much everybody I call is talking about cutting pipes and like welding them. It's really hard to find a good exhaust guy. So we're gonna leave this like this for now. I'm gonna put it back together because this has to go back in the car and the exhaust needs to be on the engine before it goes in. But the first thing I'm gonna do when the weather gets nicer is to actually take this into a shop and have somebody do a sort of straight pipe DPF delete. I've owned plenty of diesel vehicles to know that I don't necessarily want a straight pipe. I want to keep a CAT function on this. I don't hate the environment. It's just that these systems are hard to maintain after 10 years on the road or whatever. So I don't necessarily want my vehicle to be polluting. It's just that I have to get rid of the original system here because I just can't afford to put everything back together with new parts. So long story short, I want to delete the system, but I want to retain a CAT function. So I'm going to get a high flow diesel CAT, probably get rid of the two center mufflers, get rid of the DPF, and just do a nice straight pipe into a CAT out the back mufflers. That said, let's put this back on the engine, and that's the last piece that we were missing before that goes back into the truck. And just like that, the engine is ready to go in. Here we are, boys and girls, the moment we have all been waiting for. The engine is ready to go back up in the truck. I am super excited. Now, to save me a lot of work filming this, please go ahead and click here and watch episode 1 in reverse, which is exactly what we're gonna do to put the motor back up in there. When you finish watching, please join us back up for the starting of the motor. I'm just kidding, of course, but it is a pretty cold day today. In fact, hey, how cold is it?
The temperature in Gatineau right now is minus 23 degrees. There is currently an extreme cold warning in effect.
The fact of the matter is it's very cold outside, and although my garage is pretty well isolated, the heater does need to stay running to keep me alive while I'm trying to put this motor back in the car. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna load up a nice little song for you guys. There we go. Get yourself a beverage, sit back on the couch and enjoy watching me putting this motor back in the car, and hopefully at the end of this video somewhere we're gonna be able to crank it and start it. All right, let's go.
Side note, always make sure to plug in the diesel lines before you turn the key to prime the pump. Very important.
All right, truck runs. We are doing okay, but still lots of work to finish off. So why don't we just go ahead and add everything up in this episode so we don't have to cut it up at the end. What's left to do? I've got all the suspension, got to put the exhaust, hook up the drive shaft, do the upgraded transmission oil cooler, change the transmission oil, fuel filter, and a few other bits and pieces. So let's just go get it done right now, and we're gonna wrap this episode hopefully with the car coming outside. I'm more or less finished with the engine. So I have to close the bumper, put the car on the ground. Before I do that, I wanted to show you a couple of the upgrades that I've kind of done that I've wanted to do for a long time. One is the oil cooler, the second one is the fuel filter. So I'm going to make a separate episode on the oil cooler because I think there's a bigger discussion to be had about the 722.9, the oil cooler, and the oil capacity and transmission. There's some options for upgrading that. This is the original oil cooler for the transmission. My GL has the tow hitch and the stock wiring harness for towing a trailer. I believe this is part of the towing package, if you will, because this is an optional item. Some of the trucks out there, the MLs, the R classes, don't necessarily have this, is optional. And I suspect that's because they don't tow. They're not equipped with a towing package. The way Mercedes did this, oil comes from the transmission, hits the thermostat. If it's really hot, the thermostat opens up, goes through the cooler, comes back out, goes into the radiator, actually. So from here, it goes into the radiator and then goes back into the transmission. When the oil is cold and the thermostat is closed, it bypasses the cooler and actually goes right through the radiator. So the radiator will always keep it at sort of coolant temperature, but if you're towing, if you're going uphill, something like that, the thermostat will open up and start cooling the oil further. I have nothing against the actual design. It's pretty neat. And it works well in the summer where you can utilize the cooler, or in the winter when the temperature is low enough and it just goes to the radiator and actually warms up the oil a little bit faster. The problem is this is all aluminum, and as you can tell from mine, the fittings have disintegrated. Kind of see it right there. So what ends up happening is this starts leaking. And once it starts leaking, obviously you have a few options. You can go and buy the stock piece from Mercedes, and when I looked at it, this was something like $250. And on top of that, you have to also deal with the stock lines, which in my case are actually rusted right there. So quite a few pieces that can kind of go wrong. And when they do, to actually replace this, the rad's fine. There's nothing wrong with the actual cooler here, but when the thermostat and the lines go bad, you're looking at $300-400 without really improving the overall design in any way, just replacing with stock. So what I did when this thing failed is I actually deleted it. So what I did is I got rid of the lines going in here, and I just bypassed it and went right into the rad, which was fine in the winter. I didn't have any issues. I did go out towing one time during the summer with that setup. I had it for about a year, and I did see the temperatures of the oil kind of go a little bit higher than I was comfortable with. So clearly you need a radiator, but I wasn't going to go ahead and install this back and change all the lines. So what I did is actually, with the idea that I want to tow more with this truck, is I went ahead and got myself a transmission oil cooler radiator from the junkyard for a bigger truck. So I think this came out of an F-150 or F-250, something like that. So you can see it's quite a bit larger right there, and it's actually wider too than the stock unit. The problem is with this setup, you no longer have the hookup into the rad. I suppose I could have the line going into the rad and back out, so that will help in the winter. I will keep an eye on this. If I see the car's having a hard time in the winter and shifts a little bit hard, I might have to do that. But for now, I've more or less deleted the radiator hookup, so I've got my two lines coming right out of the transmission, in and out of the transmission, into the cooler, and then out. So for towing purposes, this would be great. Now the neat part is that you actually have quite a lot of room behind the bumper on this, so it's not really a big problem to set this up. You can go bigger, you can go taller. There's lots of room around here, and I've fabbed up a couple of brackets here to be able to mount the horns as well without really getting out in the way. The lines, pretty standard fittings, go right into the rad. I gave this a try. It's not leaking at the moment, but I will keep an eye on this because it's a custom setup, so I don't want obviously this thing leaking out all over the place. That's it for the transmission oil cooler. And as I said, I want to have a separate episode on this, so we're going to talk about it separately. Now let's talk about the fuel filter. The stock location for the filter is right here. It's kind of hidden. There it is, right there. Sitting right under the sort of worst intake design I've seen ever, which is the big Mercedes Y for the OM642, which comes off the two sides here with two mass airflow sensors going into the center, into the turbo. It's a bad design. These things fail all the time. Unfortunately, it's very expensive for being such a stupid plastic piece. And it's what's even more annoying is that the Jeep version of this, the 642 in Jeep, actually has a single intake pipe right out of here that I think kind of comes in the filter over here. And you can't really retrofit it because this thing actually has 2 mass airflow sensors on each side. So unless you have somebody that can play with the software for you, you're always going to be stuck with the 2 sensors, and you're going to have faults and all that sort of stuff. But I have no idea why I didn't do that. Plenty of room, certainly in the GL, to have an air box somewhere else other than this really, really crammed up design. Anyways, I digress. So this is the fuel filter. You do have a water sensor on it that will give you a light up in the dash. I've never seen it come on. Maybe this matters more if you don't have a good diesel supply or something like that, but for me it's not really an issue. Now in this series we went ahead and opened all of this up, lots of oil leaking everywhere. Having this much stuff here in the V makes it really hard to see what's really going on. If you have issues with the motor underneath for the flaps, that's a problem. You can't really access that. Now, this to me is a pretty bad location because you have just copious amounts of room around this engine bay. I understand this motor in maybe an E-Class or a C-Class or something like that. It's very tight, but in this big truck, they could have definitely gone away with something a little bit easier to work with. So that's exactly what I'm doing. So I'm going to go ahead and replace. I'm going to show you the difference right now. This is the stock filter. There it is. And what I've done is gotten myself a nice big truck filter. 2 micron. This is the equivalent of the Cat 1R750 filter that a lot of folks use. A big filter head on the top. And what this is going to allow me to do is have a much bigger filter. It's 2 micron, it's better quality, and actually frees up space here. So now I've got a little bit of better cooling, and I've got a little bit of visibility about what's going on underneath. Plus, whenever you're ready to actually replace the filter, depending on how often you do that, you don't have to take out the Y to get access to it. Here, you'll just unscrew at the bottom, boom, comes out, in comes a new filter, and off you go. You don't have to remove lines, you don't have to remove anything. Everything just stays there, and you just replace the filter. So pretty straightforward. I fabbed up a little bracket for it. You can kind of see it right there. I toyed with a couple of different locations for installing it. Here, obviously, you have the strip, so I'm going to have to probably trim that up a little bit. I thought about putting it right here. There's a few points you can probably use to hook up on that. The problem is here you've got the fan kind of spinning, plus a few hoses for the cooling. It just makes it a little bit tight to be here with all the hoses. I was kind of hoping to stay on the side here somewhere, but there's just too much stuff. A good spot is somewhere underneath the coolant there, but you have to access it from the bottom. So that means you probably have to remove the plastic wheel well cover there. And I figured, this was an empty spot here. There's nothing behind it. I had to put the headlight obviously to make sure it doesn't interfere at the back. But this is a very good spot because actually now I have my fuel line coming out here. It's just going to go around like that, and then from here it's just going to go right in there. So actually fuel flow is going to be pretty good.
Right. So a week ago, the engine started, transmission ran fine. Then I went ahead and did the drive shaft bearing that you guys saw in the previous episode. I went to start the car and I'm getting this massive beeping noise. I checked out the transmission plug to the ISM, which is the intelligent servo module, which is responsible for shifting the gears. Cleaned out the plug, plugged it back in. Everything was fine. Got the car out of the garage, drove around for a good half an hour. Came back, parked it in front of the house. I'm like, okay, this is done. We're good to go. And the next day, the car wouldn't start again with the exact same sort of beeping that you just saw. So I'm guessing the ISM module got damaged somehow, maybe during the initial test of the engine and transmission. The drive shaft was disconnected, so maybe when I flicked it into park, it wasn't fully stopped. I have no idea. My guess is right now the ISM is it's probably got a broken piece inside where it doesn't know if it's in park. So I gotta take this off and try and repair it. The problem with the ISM module is that it's part of the immobilizer system, so you can just replace it with a new item. It has to be programmed or cloned, which is a pain in the butt. But I digress. The car is done as far as everything I wanted to do. So the work that I have to do now is additional, that wasn't planned for. In any case, thank you so much for joining me. Episode 5 was meant to be the end of the sort of maintenance part of the project. Clearly it's not, because I've still got work to do. So hopefully we'll sort this out pretty quickly, and in episode 6 we can jump into doing something more fun, which is getting the truck actually ready for the overlanding sort of plan that I've got for it. If you guys like what you see, click the thumbs up. If you want to see more, click subscribe so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos on Project GLander, the ML, the R-Class, the Avant, and the W201. Anyways, lots of work to do. I'll see you guys next time.